Be gone with you. Next time. Be gone with you. Target eliminated. Gone. Next time.
Yep, that sounds about right. From the same energy Square Enix had when Left Alive was announced comes the Diofield Chronicle, a game that plopped onto all major platforms with next to no advertising. Admittingly, I ended up trying Diofield just because it was published by Square Enix and had a similar font to Triangle Strategy. Diofield Chronicle attempts to tell an incredibly grand story detailing the exploits of the Blue Foxes, a group of mercenaries working in the titular land of Diofield, composed of a ragtag group of misfits ranging from former nobles, hunters, thieves, and even psychotic murderers. The game details their rise to power amidst a three-way war between the Kingdom of Alatea, the Empire, and the Alliance. While the story initially has a decent setup, the Diofield Chronicle kinda gets lost in its own sauce. It tries to tell a story that is incredibly huge in scope, but zooms out so far that it isn't really able to focus on any of the events that move the story along. The real-time strategy element is pretty fun, but it's also incredibly broken balance-wise, and that problem trivializes the entire rest of the game after Chapter 1. There are a ton of reasons as to why the Diofield Chronicle is a bit of a mess, from the story to the gameplay and mostly to the characters, which I'll pick apart, so let's just get straight into it. The Diofield Chronicle takes place on the titular island of Diofield. Diofield is ruled by the Kingdom of Alatea, a monarchy that is predominantly controlled by a group of nobles. This nation has mostly isolated itself thanks to the fact that the entirety of Diofield is an island. However, in recent years, the empire of the neighboring continent has decided to conquer all of the surrounding lands. The other nations on this neighboring continent have banded together to form the Alliance, a coalition dedicated to fighting back against the rising power known as the Empire. In order for both groups to continue their war, they both are in need of a resource called Jade, which powers most of their advanced weaponry, a resource which Diofield just so happens to be very rich in. This of course leads to a three-way war with Diofield firmly at the center. While this is the grand setup to the entire story, the focus of the game is entirely on the exploits of the Blue Foxes, a mercenary group created by Duke Hedis in order to act sort of as his private army. Well, it kinda does? See, here's the issue. Diofield Chronicle never really figures out whether it wants to be a character-driven epic following the Blue Foxes, or whether it wants to tell this grand political intrigue of a war drama, and in the end it kinda fails to do both. It's clear they had a huge story planned, and they want to tell the story from the beginning of the war all the way till the very end full of political issues. They want to tell this grand war story that spanned over several years, with the main characters' relationships changing over time. They however go so fast that they end up not giving enough time for any of the characters to actually develop any meaningful relationships. I mean, the game says stuff like, oh, a few months pass after the last battle, and everyone acts like they're suddenly comrades, but the player most likely doesn't feel the same. It's as if they skipped all the bonding moments between the main characters just so that they could get to their next big battle, and this is a running issue for the entirety of the game. It's pretty hard to care about this three-way giant war when most of the main participants on every side are faceless politicians. In fact, most of them are literally faceless. Even the important leaders of each faction, which the game makes a huge fuss about, are usually killed off screen or in the middle of a narration. I could probably count on one hand the amount of bad guys who actually have a face and which you fight, and none of them make it past a single battle. Plenty of events occur throughout this war with big changes happening every chapter, big enough changes that the game has a tracking power relationship chart just so players don't get confused. But it's hard to sympathize with any of it since it feels so far removed from what the main characters of the story are actually doing. The Blue Foxes feel like they're just going from one battlefield to the next, murdering faceless mooks without much direction. The cutscenes in the game are rather enjoyable to watch, although for whatever reason, they seem to stop appearing for the entirety of the middle half of the game, and they save all the cool cutscenes for random battles as opposed to pivotal conflicts which all just get narrated. In the gameplay department, Diofield Chronicle is a pretty fun time, even if it's completely busted balance-wise. Diofield Chronicle is a real-time strategy game, but a more accurate description would be a real-time strategy light. You can use a cursor to control your units just like any other RTS. The difference is that you don't have to deal with making units, gathering resources, or any of that. Instead, you only have to worry about controlling your 4 units in every battlefield. It might seem pretty simple, but it's really a good thing that it's this way, since trying to play a traditional RTS on a console like the Switch or PS4 would be a huge pain. With only 4 units, it makes the control scheme feel totally fine, if slightly jank. There are 4 main rows, with each row having subclasses with different skills. In essence, there are 9 unique character types, with 4 general classes of DPS, ranged DPS, tank, and mage. Battle consists of units auto-attacking, but mostly of activating skills which all have different cooldowns. All the skills in the game have pretty cool animations for each ability that are pretty distinct from one another. A common criticism of Diofield Chronicle is that the game hands you all these different characters, yet you're only limited to fielding 4 at a time. To alleviate this issue, each character can also equip an adjutant, basically another character, which allows them to utilize that partner's skill in battle. It's a rather fun system that allows a decent variation in combination of which skills and characters to use. Well, at least it would be, except for a couple severe issues. The first main problem is with regards to the main character himself, Andreas Ronderson, and in fact it gave him a DPS skill that resets upon kill as his very first one. Combine this with the fact that the game at the end of chapter 1, for whatever reason, gives you an accessory which has the same stat line as all of the endgame accessories, and you quickly realize that you don't need any character other than Andreas to finish the entirety of the game. He's so strong, he's able to solo levels entirely on his own, with a skill that is able to do 80% of a foe's life bar in one go. And because he's the main character of the game, everyone is for sure going to be using him. Slap on an easy attack buff that can be reapplied anytime it runs out, and I completed nearly every stage in the game in roughly 2 minutes or less. Hard mode doesn't change anything since the game makes a smart choice of higher difficulty leading to higher damage numbers, as opposed to making enemies damage sponges, which I really like, except that damage doesn't really matter when they all die in one hit. I think the only stage in the game that took me more than 2 minutes was the one stage where they didn't allow you to use Andreas. Most of the other characters are way more even in terms of how strong they are, with many only becoming ridiculous monsters upon reaching the final chapter, as the game saved all of the game-breaking accessories there. The other problem with the units is more to do with how the adjutant system works. While you can technically use 8 characters in every battle thanks to the sub-commanders, who is actually useful as one is incredibly limited because the damage of the moves are solely based on the sub-commander's stats. And in a game where you're basically given barely enough money and resources to equip 3 to 4 characters, thanks in no small part to how characters in the game require a resource which is super limited up until the very final chapter, what happens is that you are only ever going to power up your 4 main characters. This leads to your sub-commanders being entirely utility-based, as their damage would be pitiful anyways. And out of the 9 classes in the game, only 3 offer any real forms of utility, with the other 6 being straight useless as sub-commanders after the first 2 chapters of the game. This is also ignoring the fact that the game just straight up gives sub-commanders less EXP than the main commanders at the end of battle, making the gap between their strengths wider and wider with every subsequent fight. Limiting resources like this can be good sometimes in forcing players to make creative decisions to compensate. Here though, I feel like it just kind of limits what classes players get to use, as due to the upgrade resource being limited, it's hard to start raising a new class if you're halfway through the game and have already invested resources in another one. They let you reset the skill points for character and classes at any time for a price, but weapon upgrades can't be for whatever reason, which is kind of important for doing damage. Finally, I think the equipment in the game is pretty boring. Most of the accessories only offer marginal benefits and are also heinously expensive. It's pretty disappointing that until the final chapter, every new accessory you can get at the shop is only a marginal improvement over the previous one, like adding 12 attack instead of 10 attack. It's just not very exciting, nor is there really a reason to purchase it since the weapon upgrades are probably a much higher priority. There are more interesting accessories, but Diofield Chronicle decides to lock all of them till the very end of the game, which is an exceedingly odd choice. Yes, a lot of them are incredibly broken, but had they offered much weaker choices periodically throughout the game, it would have given players much more thought into how they want to outfit their characters. Instead, they only offer inconsequential stat upgrades up until near the end of the game, where all of a sudden, there are like 25 new and insanely expensive accessories in the shop, all with crazy effects like restoring EP, 100% crit chance at max HP, 30% more skill damage. It just seems like an incredibly odd choice if I'm being totally honest. Thanks to this fact, I don't think I bothered equipping any accessories until the final chapters. As for the battles themselves, they're alright even if they suffer from a lack of creativity. Every mission in the game essentially boils down to murder every other enemy on the screen or murder a specific commander, which forces you to kill everything along the way to him before he spawns. There are bonus objectives, but the game has the same one for every single battle. There's always one that says beat the mission under 6 or 8 minutes, and one that says don't let anyone die. The main story missions also have a chest that is slightly out of the way, but still incredibly easy for the player to get to. It is a shame that these side objectives are so uninspired. It would have made a great chance to craft stages that force players to play differently depending on what each of the side missions asked of them. Like one where perhaps the escort unit can't go under 90% HP, or one where enemies have to be beaten in a certain order. It would make players have to approach each battlefield a bit more thoughtfully rather than just bum rushing the nearest group of enemies. Really, most of the problems in the gameplay just come from how imbalanced some of the characters are, rendering most of the battles moot due to how easy it is to crush enemies. Alright, finally let's tackle the brunt of what I want to talk about for Diofield Chronicle. Earlier, I mentioned that the story is a bit unfocused, not in the sense that it has too many different things it's trying to focus on, but rather it doesn't really focus on anything it's trying to show. Events happen throughout the game, but the player never feels as if any of these events actually matter, and I think the main reason for this can be attributed to the main characters. Diofield Chronicle is trying to tell a story from the perspective of the Blue Foxes, of how their exploits affect the coming war, how their influences increases with each battle, and how that influence leads to fractures in their relationship. The issue I have is just that the main characters are shockingly unlikable, which is kind of a problem when they're trying to tell such a character-driven narrative, well, supposedly. There are 4 main characters: Andreas Ronderson, a fallen noble who wants to obtain revenge for the death of his friend, Prince Levantia, as well as the protagonist of the story which we control, Frederick Lester, Andreas and Levantia's childhood friend who has the same go, Walter Quinn Redditch, a noblewoman whose household was recently destroyed, and finally, Iscarion Colchester, an archer who renounced his nobility after realizing how corrupt the knights are. While there is a huge cast of characters who join your party, none of them are important and barely appear for most of the cutscenes. These 4 are the clear focus and act as the 4 joint leaders of the Blue Foxes once Yozim Jordan passes away at the end of Chapter 1. They are the ones who make all the big decisions, and they are the ones who show up 95% of the time. The game makes discussing each one of the different ideologies and how they clash with each other a focal point of the story. The problem is that we never learn anything about them beyond these ideologies. We never get to see them hang out or do anything besides their interactions in the war room where they're constantly butting heads. They could have developed their relationships, but the game skips all of that in favor of narrating more about the war. So what finally happens when everyone starts to stand up against each other? Instead of being torn that these 4 comrades who've been with each other through thick and thin are now standing against one another, I'm more surprised that these 4 even made it this far in the first place. Before we go any further, I'm gonna say spoiler warning right here, because I'm going to get into the ending of the story so I can explain what I assume the game was going for and why I think it really doesn't work. If you do want to play the game after everything I said, feel free to skip ahead using the chapter link to the conclusion. For the rest of you, let's continue onwards. In my opinion, regardless of whether you want your protagonist to be a hero, an anti-hero, a villain, or a hero who ends up on the wrong path, your main characters have to be likable to some extent. There has to be something about them that is charming in the first place, so that when you see their fall from grace or when they're forced into a hard situation, you actually care about seeing the main character prevail against their circumstances. Or if they become a villain, you understand what exactly drove them to that end. All of the main characters in Diofield Chronicle never reach that point because we simply don't get to know any of them to any extent beyond the immediate fighting. We are told they become fast friends, and apparently trusted enough that everyone in the Blue Fox agrees to have them become the 4 cornerstones of the entire company, but we never see why. The game just says, yep, they're important and we're meant to accept it at face value. This becomes a huge issue when throughout the story, Diofield Chronicle constantly tries to show all of their faults, and how their relationship devolves as the Blue Foxes grow stronger and stronger. However, rather than all of these faults humanizing our main characters, they instead just make them look like the biggest assholes ever. They have all of these complaints against each other, none of which ever gets resolved, and all of which paints everyone in the worst possible light. Walter Quinn is straight up just a psycho murderer who enjoys killing people for fun. Frederick acts like an uppity noble who thinks the commoners are insane and should be put in their place, while Iskarion is constantly arguing for the rights of the common people, except that he doesn't do anything but complain about it. Andreas, our protagonist, pretty much hand waves everyone's problems, playing mediator, and ignoring all of the issues until it's too late, which this might have been done on purpose considering the ending, but it doesn't change the fact that he's also terrible. Even though we're supposed to buy into the solid friendship between these 4 comrades who formed the cornerstone for the Blue Foxes, I'm more shocked that it didn't already end up in a bloodbath way earlier. Every subsequent battle, from the Peasant Rebellion to the nobles fighting back to the Blue Foxes even killing their own boss after he's found out to be connected with the Empire, only serves to make each of the main characters look worse and worse. Frederick, aside from acting as a classist butthole, also lies and cheats everyone in the group by pretending to be the dead Levantian Shatham in order to become king, all the while becoming more brash, angry, and generally exemplifying all of his worst traits. Walter Quinn, as I said, just straight up enjoys killing people, making the situation actively worse for the Blue Foxes. She is so insane that everyone aside from Andreas is wondering if she should still be one of the leaders, which in turn makes the player question, why was she even chosen in the first place? Her death is supposed to be this big sad moment for the party, but it's more like good riddance because wow, is she terrible. Iskarion is probably the least bad out of the 4, but that's only because everyone else is so awful. He has good intentions in the sense that he wants to protect the common folk, and he wants them to have more rights, but he doesn't make any real progress in accomplishing that. All he does throughout the game is complain about how nobles are bad, yet every time a conflict comes up, he still ends up following whatever Andreas and Frederick decide on. He does this so many times that you think he would leave and join the Commoner Rebellion, yet he still stays until the very last chapter, where then he finally decides enough is enough. Although instead of having a huge conflict with Frederick and Andreas, he just leaves the Blue Foxes and vanishes from the plot entirely. Finally, there is Andreas. Andreas is the reason why I talked about how important it is to like a character even if you want him to end up as an anti-hero or villain, because that's exactly what he ends up being. The big twist of Diofield Chronicle is that Andreas is the secret mastermind behind everything. That the Blue Fox's rise to power was all part of his scheme in order to kill General Zavatian Shugo, the big evil general who is the only one out of the entire empire who actually gets a name and a face. Which sounds bad, but considering the Alliance gets 0 people with that distinction, they're still much better off. Anyways, yeah, at the end, he goes into a giant monologue about his backstory and why he hates Savantian. Andreas then kills him, then he kills Frederick, as Andreas has a philosophy that he should give power to those who deserve it, and Frederick was acting really dumb in the final chapter. This sort of ending would have been cool had I cared about either Frederick or Andreas to any extent. Diofield Chronicle feels like they started with both the ending and the setting of the story, then they tried to madly dash all the way to that end without taking the time to breathe at any point. They wanted to tell a dark war drama where none of the sides were correct, including the main characters, but they failed to establish any sort of reason for us to care about any side in this great war. Pretty much all 3 countries are entirely faceless. The Empire only has General Zavatian Shugo, someone who we don't even meet in person until the final battle. The Alliance has nobody, and the Kingdom of Alatea has a bunch of important people they mention, but we meet less than a handful in person, all of which the Blue Foxes kill within the chapter they show up. Therefore, the only people we can remotely have any attachment to is the Blue Foxes. They intentionally tried to make the 4 main characters flawed so that they would have reasons to break away from each other. However, I'd argue that they never even seemed like a cohesive team in the first place because the game forgot to establish that fact in the beginning. even if they wanted them to have a huge falling out in the end, they had to give the players a reason to care about this falling out in the first place, and that just wasn't there. The best way I can describe Diofield Chronicle is exactly what I said in the beginning. It's a bit of a mess. The story is incredibly unfocused on what it wants to do. It can't decide whether it wants to tell a super grand war story between three nations, or it wants to focus on the exploits of one small mercenary group, and in the end, it kind of fails to do either. Rather than both sides enhancing the overall story, it feels like both sides are competing for the limited screen time. If they wanted to have a three-way war drama, they should establish clear characters on all sides with cutscenes so that we have faces to attach to these giant lifeless kingdoms. If they want to focus the entire story on the Blue Foxes and their rise to power amidst this war, then they should have dedicated more time to establishing the main characters and their relationships instead of just time skipping all of that so they could show more war narration. In the end, what we got is a war story where our main characters just kind of bumble around a giant war full of random goons that they slap one by one until they run out of people to slap and then have to slap each other. The gameplay plays fairly well, attacks animate nicely, and has some pretty novel ideas in terms of having different classes and an adjutant system, but all of that kind of gets thrown out the window due to how broken Andreas and the Chapter 1 accessory is. Honestly, if you were looking for this exact same type of story done way better, just play Triangle Strategy. It feels like Diofield Chronicle is aiming for the same idea, but ends up doing it a lot worse. If you got anything you want to add about Diofield Chronicle, maybe you play it yourself even, feel free to do so in the comments below. All the supported stuff, like, subscribe, notification, all buttons are in the same place as always. That'll be it for this one. I'll see you later. Till next time.